in a dystopian, alternate 1920s America, where there is an imperial society, minimal social unrest, and lethal chambers for those who want to commit suicide. Master Cthulhu has received a head injury and during his convalescence discovered the forbidden play, The King in Yellow. The head injury changes him and he slowly descends into madness, believing he is in the world of the King in Yellow and an heir to Hastur himself. Having created himself a grand delusion, and with the aid of the strange and disturbing Mr. Wilde, he plots to force his cousin Louis to relinquish the imaginary title so he can take the crown himself. All in The Repairer of Reputations, the first story in the King in Yellow series by Robert W. Chambers. Link to part 1 above. To help us grow, please like, subscribe, and be sure to click the bell. But just as importantly, comment and share. The algorithm must be fed, and comments are one of its favourite meals. You might want to help guide our explorations of the strange, dark and terrible by joining the Eldritch Order on Discord. You can via our Patreon or YouTube, coming soon. We release 3 episodes a week, 2 live streams that chat guides the story on, and complete versions when a story concludes. In the final part, Hildred has enacted his desperate plan to take the crown, but has an unexpected setback when he returns to Mr. Wilde's apartment. For now, it's time to enter the Cave of Chronicles. The time had come. The people should know the son of Hastur, and the whole world bow to the black stars which hang in the sky over Carcosa. Vance leaned on the table, his head buried in his hands. Mr. Wilde drew a rough sketch on the margin of yesterday's Herald with a bit of lead pencil. It was a plan of Horbuck's rooms. Then he wrote out the order and affixed the seal. And shaking like a palsied man, I signed my first writ of execution with my name, Hildred Rex. Mr. Wilde clambered to the floor and, unlocking the cabinet, took a long square box from the first shelf. This he brought to the table and opened. A new knife lay in the tissue paper inside, and I picked it up and handed it to Vance, along with the order and the plan of Horbuck's apartment. Then Mr. Wilde told Vance he could go, and he went, shambling like an outcast of the slums. I sat for a while, watching the daylight fade behind the square tower of the Judson Memorial Church, and finally, gathering up the manuscript and notes, took my hat and started for the door. Mr. Wilde watched me in silence. When I had stepped into the hall, I looked back. Mr. Wilde's small eyes were still fixed on me. Behind him, the shadows gathered in the fading light. Then I closed the door behind me and went out into the darkening streets. I had eaten nothing since breakfast, but I was not hungry. A wretched, half-starved creature who stood looking across the street at the lethal chamber noticed me and came up to tell me a tale of misery. I gave him money, I don't know why, and he went away without thanking me. An hour later, another outcast approached and whined his story. I had a blank bit of paper in my pocket, on which was traced the yellow sign, and I handed it to him. He looked at it stupidly for a moment, and then, with an uncertain glance at me, folded it with what seemed to me exaggerated care, and placed it in his bosom. The electric lights were sparkling among the trees, and the new moon stood in the sky above the lethal chamber. It was tiresome waiting in the square. I wandered from the Marble Arch to the artillery stables and back again to the lotos fountain. The flowers and grants exhaled a fragrance which troubled me. The jet of the fountain played in the moonlight, and the musical splash of falling drops reminded me of the tinkle of chained mail in Hawberk's shop. But it was not so fascinating, and the dull sparkle of the moonlight on the water brought no such sensation of exquisite pleasure as when sunshine played over the polished steel of a corselet on Hawberk's knee. I watched the bats darting and turning above the water plants in the fountain basin, but their rapid, jerky flight set my nerves on edge, and I went away again to walk aimlessly to and fro among the trees. The artillery stables were dark, but in the cavalry barracks, the officers' windows were brightly lighted, and the sallyport was constantly filled with troopers in fatigue, carrying straw and harnesses with baskets filled with tin dishes. Twice the mounted sentry at the gates was changed while I wandered up and down the asphalt walk. I looked at my watch. It was nearly time. The lights in the barracks went out one by one. The barred gate was closed, and every minute or two an officer passed in through the side wicket, leaving the rattle of accoutrements and the jingle of spurs on the night air. The square had become very silent. The last homeless loiterer had been driven away by the grey-coated park policeman. The car tracks along Worcester Street were deserted, and the only sound which broke the stillness was the stamping of the sentry's horse and the ring of his sabre against the saddle pommel. In the barracks, the officers' quarters were still lighted, and military servants passed and repassed before the bay windows. 12 o'clock sounded from the new spire of St. Francis Xavier, and at the last stroke of the sad-toned bell, a figure passed through the wicket beside the portcullis, returned the salute of the sentry, and crossing the street, entered the square and advanced towards the Bendick apartment house.
"Lewis?"
I called. The man pivoted on his spurred heels and came straight toward me.
"Is that you, Hildred?" "Yes, you are on time."
I took his offered hand, and we strolled towards the lethal chamber. He rattled on about his wedding and the graces of Constance and their future prospects, calling my attention to his captain's shoulder straps and the triple gold arabesque on his sleeve and fatigue cap. I believe I listened as much to the music of his spurs and sabre as I did to the boyish babble, and at last we stood under the elms on the 4th Street corner of the square, opposite the lethal chamber. Then he laughed and asked me what I wanted with him. I motioned him to a seat on a bench under the electric light and sat down beside him. He looked at me curiously, with that same searching glance which I hate and fear so in doctors. I felt the insult of his look, but he did not know it, and I carefully concealed my feelings.
Well, old chap,
he inquired.
what can I do for you?
I drew from my pocket the manuscript and notes of the Imperial Dynasty of America, and looking him in the eye said,
I will tell you, on your word as a soldier, promise me to read this manuscript from beginning to end without asking me a question. Promise me to read these notes in the same way, and promise me to listen to what I have to tell later. I promise if you wish it,
he said pleasantly.
Give me the paper, Hildred.
He began to read, raising his eyebrows with a puzzled, whimsical air which made me tremble with suppressed anger. As he advanced, his eyebrows contracted and his lips seemed to form the word rubbish. Then he looked slightly bored, but apparently for my sake read with an attempt at interest, which presently ceased to be an effort. He started when, in the closely written pages, he came to his own name, and when he came to mine, he lowered the paper and looked sharply at me for a moment. But he kept his word and resumed his reading, and I let the half-formed questions die on his lips unanswered. When he came to the end and read the signature of Mr. Wilde, he folded the paper carefully and returned it to me. I handed him the notes and he settled back, pushing his fatigue cap up to his forehead with a boyish gesture which I remembered so well in school. I watched his face as he read, and when he finished, I took the notes with the manuscript and placed them in my pocket. Then I unfolded a scroll marked with the yellow sign. He saw the sign, but did not seem to recognize it, and I called his attention to it somewhat sharply.
Well,
He said,
I see it. What is it? It is the yellow sign.
I said angrily.
Oh, that's it, is it?
Said Lewis in that flattering voice which Dr. Archer used to employ with me, and would probably have employed again had I not settled his affair for him. I kept my rage down and answered as steadily as possible.
Listen, you have engaged your word. I'm listening, old chap.
He replied soothingly. I began to speak very calmly.
Dr. Archer, having by some means become possessed of the secret of the imperial succession, attempted to deprive me of my right, alleging that because of a fall from my horse 4 years ago, I had become mentally deficient. He presumed to place me under restraint in his own house in hopes of either driving me insane or poisoning me. I have not forgotten it. I visited him last night, and the interview was final.
Lewis turned quite pale, but did not move. I resumed triumphantly.
There are yet 3 people to be interviewed in the interests of Mr. Wilde and myself. They are my cousin Lewis, Mr. Hallberg, and his daughter Constance.
Lewis sprang to his feet, and I arose also, and flung the paper marked with the yellow sign on the ground.
Oh, I don't need that to tell you what I have to say.
I cried with a laugh of triumph.
You must renounce the crown to me. Do you hear? To me.
Lewis looked at me with a startled air, but recovering himself, said kindly,
Of course I renounce the... What is it I must renounce? The crown.
I said angrily.
Of course,
He answered.
I renounce it. Come, old chap, I'll walk back to your rooms with you. Don't try any of your doctor's tricks on me.
I cried, trembling with fury.
Don't act as if you think I am insane.
What nonsense, he replied.
Come, it's getting late, Hildred. No,
I shouted.
you must listen. You cannot marry. I forbid it. Do you hear? I forbid it. you shall renounce the crown, and in reward I grant you exile. But if you refuse, you shall die."
He tried to calm me, but I was roused at last, and drawing my long knife barred his way. Then I told him how they would find Dr. Archer in the cellar with his throat cut open, and I laughed in his face when I thought of Vance and his knife and the order signed by me.
"Ah, you are the king,"
I cried.
"but I shall be king. You are here to keep from me the empire over all the habitable earth. I was born the cousin of a king, but I shall be king."
Lewis stood white and rigid before me. Suddenly a man came running up 4th Street, entered the gate of the Lethal Temple, traversed the path to the bronze doors at full speed, and plunged into the death chamber with the cry of one demented. And I laughed until I wept tears, for I had recognised Vance. I knew that Horberg and his daughter were no longer in my way.
"Go,"
I cried.
"You have ceased to be a menace. You will never marry Constance now, and if you marry anyone else in your exile, I will visit you as I did my doctor last night. Mr. Wilde takes charge of you tomorrow."
Then I turned and darted into South 5th Avenue, and with a cry of terror, Lewis dropped his belt and sabre and followed me like the wind. I heard him close behind me at the corner of Bleecker Street, and I dashed into the doorway under Horberg's sign. He cried, "Halt, or I fire!" Then, when he saw that I flew up the stairs, leaving Horberg's shop below, he left me, and I heard him hammering and shouting at their door as though it were possible to arouse the dead. Mr. Wilde's door was open, and I entered crying,
"It is done! It is done! Let the nations rise and look upon their king!"
But I could not find Mr. Wilde, so I went to the cabinet and took the splendid diadem from its case. Then I drew on the white silk robe, embroidered with the yellow sign, and placed the crown upon my head. At last I was king. King by my right in Hastur. King because I knew the mystery of the Hades, and my mind had sounded the depths of the lake of Hali. I was king. The first grey pencilings of dawn would raise a tempest which would shake 2 hemispheres. Then, as I stood, my every nerve pitched to the highest tension, faint with the joy and splendour of my thought. Without, in the dark passage, a man groaned. I seized the tallow dip and sprang to the door. The cat passed me like a demon, and the tallow dip went out. But my long knife flew swifter than she, and I heard her screech, and I knew that my knife had found her. For a moment I listened to her tumbling and thumping about in the darkness, and then, when her frenzy ceased, I lighted a lamp and raised it over my head. Mr. Wilde lay on the floor with his throat torn open. At first I thought he was dead, but as I looked, a green sparkle came into his sunken eyes. His mutilated hand trembled, and then a spasm reached his mouth from ear to ear. For a moment my terror and despair gave place to hope, but as I bent over him, his eyeballs rolled clean around in his head, and he died. Then, while I stood transfixed with rage and despair, seeing my crown, my empire, every hope and every ambition, my very life lying prostrate there with the dead master, They came, seized me from behind and bound me until my veins stood out like cords and my voice failed with the paroxysms of my frenzied screams. But still I raged, bleeding and infuriated among them, and more than one policeman felt my sharp teeth. And then, when I could no longer move, they came nearer. I saw old Horberg, and behind him my cousin Lewis, ghastly face, and further away in the corner, a woman, Constance, weeping softly.
"Ah, I see it now,"
I shrieked.
"You have seized the throne and the empire. Woe, woe to you who are crowned with the crown of the king in yellow."
Editor's note: Mr. Castaigne died yesterday in the asylum for the criminal insane. So ends The Repairer of Reputations. If you enjoyed the tale, it helps us if you let others know, so please click on the like button and share with others that may be interested. Subscribing will let you travel with us on further adventures of the dark and terrible, with the bell notifying you as we set off. If you want to join our Eldritch Order on Discord, come visit us on Patreon or YouTube, coming soon. Then you can join in the discussions and even help guide the choice of stories. There is an ever-growing list of insane benefits. See the description for details of the Patreon and for a link to Canje Studios to find out about modern board games, where you can create your own dark and terrible stories. Until next time, farewell. Never forget, the plans of the insane and desperate may fail, but most often they still leave a wide swathe of devastation in their wake.